Well, if you've ever spent any time behind bars, you know that one of the worst things about it is the sense of profound isolation that you feel. A few years ago, I got involved with my church's prison ministry team. We were exchanging letters with troubled teens who were incarcerated in a juvenile detention center. Now, for me, it was a profound calling because I was not only living out the words of Matthew 25:35, I was in prison and you visited me, but also because I'd had my own very troubled youth, and so a lot of this hit really close to home to me. Well, I began writing letters back and forth with a 16-year-old who was doing time on drug-related charges. And I'll never forget his first letter as long as I live. He said, "I know I'm writing to a Christian, someone who goes to church, and this is very uncomfortable for me. I'm not sure if I even believe in God. I'm only writing because I'm so lonely and depressed here. My whole world is this tiny little cell with its white concrete walls. And all I have in here is a bed, a desk with a stool, a sink, and a toilet. I just want to write letters so it'll help take my mind somewhere else." It was heartbreaking to see these words coming from a 16-year-old. And in this gut-wrenching confession, I learned that he wasn't just in one prison. He was in two. Yes, there was the confining little cell with its glaring and oppressive white walls, but the worst prison was that of his own mind. You know, Franklin Roosevelt once said, "People are not prisoners of fate, but they're prisoners of their own minds." Now, this statement, it rings true not just for the young man I was writing to all these years ago, but for many of us. You know, as I've said before, life is fragile. Our conditions, our circumstances, our feelings, our relationships, our health, all of it can change on a dime. And it's moments like those where we're just blindsided with something that before we know it, you hear the sound of cell doors slamming shut, and suddenly we find ourselves being prisoners in our own minds. Now, for us in the church, it's the Advent season, and while most of us are looking forward to Christmas and maybe putting on a few more pounds that we'll resolve to shed in the new year, for others, this is a miserable time of year. And I'm not talking about our friends, the Grinch or Scrooge here. See, if you Google holiday blues, aside from finding some really cheesy Dean Martin songs, you'll find a whole host of articles that talk about how for many people, the holidays are a time of increased depression, stress, loneliness, anxiety, and grief. You know, I find myself in such a place right now. But I'm guessing there might be a few of you here today who also feel this way. Or maybe it has nothing to do with the season. Maybe it's something that runs much deeper. But whatever the case, I hope to share a word of comfort with you today in a message that I've called Piercing the Darkness. Now, some of you probably already know that I love the writings of St. Paul. I preach from his letters any chance I get, and I'm always quoting him. But when you saw that I'd picked one of his prison letters to kick off Advent, you might have cringed. You know, I mean, what could Paul being in prison possibly have to do with getting into the Christmas spirit? And when I say Paul was in prison, He was in the worst kind of prison that you could ever imagine. It was called Mamertine Prison, and it has been dubbed the House of Darkness. The Roman historian Sallust said that its neglect, darkness, and stench gave it a hideous and terrifying appearance. Mamertine lacked even the most basic necessities. Prisoners suffered from unbearable heat and dehydration. There was no ventilation, so at times it would have been difficult to even breathe. There were no beds. They had to sleep on the ground, and prisoners were either chained at the wrists or on one or both of their ankles. And it was dubbed the House of Darkness for a reason. Mamertine was devoid of light. If there was any light at all, it was in the tiniest of pinpricks, but most of the cells had no natural light at all. And then at night, the torches were extinguished, so the darkness was absolute. Can you imagine what this must have been like for Paul? It's unfathomable. I mean, I'm not kidding. I was in tears when I was researching this stuff. This is what Paul went through when he was in Rome. Now just think about that for a second. And then look at the words of our text this morning. I thank my God every time I remember you, constantly praying with joy in every one of my prayers for all of you. Wow. What can I say? This doesn't sound like the writings of a man in prison, either in chains or in his own mind. He's thanking God. He has joy in his heart. And you find this language not just here, but all throughout the letter. How is this even possible? Well, first of all, he looks backwards to the past in the best way possible, with thanksgiving because of his fond memories for the Philippian church. You see, when he reflects on their sharing in the gospel from the first day, he's not only talking about their financial support of his ministry, he's talking about in the Greek, their koinonia, their fellowship, their joint participation, partnership, and communion. He held everything in common with his brothers and sisters in the Philippian church. And so what does that tell us today? See, even in his time of darkness, Paul could look back on these happier times, and it brought him comfort. He's reflecting on what God has done in his life. You know, I learned pretty early on that the teenager I was writing to had come from a pretty stable home life. He had a mother and father and an older brother who loved him in spite of everything that he'd done. He'd just fallen in with the wrong crowd, and he'd gotten into drugs. So in my letters, I would ask him questions about his family and about his friends to try to get him thinking about all the good that he'd had in his life up to that point. He told me a lot of stories, and some of them had me laughing out loud, and so I knew that he must have been laughing too when he was writing them. So what about you? If you find yourself in a prison of your own mind, in a time of darkness right now, in spite of everything, what are you thankful for? You see, it's like I said, our lives are fragile and things can change on a dime, but we can be confident. We can be certain that he's begun a good work in us. He's planted seeds in each one of our lives, and if you slow down, if you stop to just take a moment and look back, you'll start to see where God has been in your lives. You'll start to see his work, and you'll start to see that he's always been with you, and you'll see that he's always had his hand on you. And that's why Paul's thanking God for his memories. It's because he knows God brought it all about. There's joy in our memories when we see how God has shaped our lives. We pierce the darkness through thanksgiving. But God doesn't just start a good work in us. God will finish it too. Paul says he's confident that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. Once again, he's filled with confidence and hope, a hope that seizes the present moment and looks towards the future. When Paul wrote this letter to the Philippians, he was awaiting trial. He knew this could be the end for him. But he knew no matter what fate was in store for him, that God would continue to grow those seeds that had been planted in the church at Philippi. Christ began his work of the kingdom at the first advent, and he's continuing it until the second. And that message, it's so important for those of us who are struggling today. He's working in you right here, right now. You know, my poor friend that I was writing those letters to, naturally, he couldn't see any hope for the future. He talked about how time just dragged so slowly and how he felt like he was never going to get out of there. So I started asking him about his favorite subjects in school. I asked him what he liked to do in his spare time, and he told me that he liked cars. He wanted to learn to work on cars. So I got permission from the facility, and I sent him resources from technical schools in the area that could get him into the field. So reassuring him of his past, I wanted him to think a little bit about his future too. Now that can be really hard to do when things are tough, right? And God knows I've been there too. I'm there right now. We tend to have this dark cloud of condemnation hanging over us that's always raining down negative thoughts on us. You know, I'm not good enough. I'm struggling all the time. I never get any peace. Why doesn't God answer any of my prayers? My friends, I don't know how, but I trust in the God who has begun a good work, that he will complete it. Our God can make a way when there is no way. And in the meantime, I trust that he's given us an umbrella. Philippians 4:7 says, "And the peace of God which transcends all understanding will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Our circumstances don't have to be perfect for us to be at peace. We can be at peace, and I know that this is hard, if we just trust the fact that God is at work in our lives. It may be beyond our understanding, but he is there. He's working. Dwell in my assurance. That's his promise here, to guard our hearts and our minds from negativity with his peace. We pierce the darkness through assurance. And moving along, it's important to point out that we have to do our part too. I love what Paul says here in verses 9 through 11, because it's really our formula for spiritual formation. Now, I'm pretty bad at math, but it goes something like this: growing in love for God and one another, plus growing in our knowledge of God and God's work, equals being blameless. So in other words, these things all lead to spiritual maturity. So we can never be stagnant in our walk with God, even if we're walking with a limp. I don't know whatever happened to the young man I was writing to. We were required to be anonymous. But towards the end of his sentence, he started going to see his chaplain and attending services there. He started reading the Bible. He still wasn't sure if he believed in God or not, but it was making him feel better. In his very last letter to me, he said he planned on joining a church when he got out. I still pray for him, even after all these years. But you know, I'm confident, like Paul, that maybe I'll get to meet him someday. And I say that because I saw God begin a good work in his life. See, if you seek out the love of God and the knowledge of God, no matter where you're at in life, you'll begin to grow. We pierce the darkness through spiritual growth. And as I draw this message to a close, I want to be careful, because I'm not saying do these things and all your problems will just magically disappear overnight. You know, everyone's different, and there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all problem to every solution. You know, there's thousands of self-help books that might tell us otherwise, but what I'm saying here is if you do these things, it's all part of Christ beginning to complete that work in you, even if it's really hard to see right now. So if you're in a season of darkness, this will allow pinpricks of light, his light, to start coming through. And what's more, we can be Philippi for one another. We can be Philippi for one another. That's what the whole idea of koinonia, of fellowship, means. We lift one another up. That's the kind of relationship that Paul had with the Philippians, and that's the relationship we're meant to have with one another. So if you know someone that's struggling right now, be their Philippi. Be their Philippi. Today in Rome, a church stands over the ruins of the old Mamertine prison. That house of darkness has become a symbol of light and hope. And I wonder if Paul, as he stood there in his cell, if he could close his eyes and envision our time, a time when a community of faith would stand above that place of evil. A community filled with love and knowledge and insight. And when he closed his eyes, that anticipation set him free. That's the meaning of Advent, the anticipation of light triumphing over darkness, freedom triumphing over bondage. Let's all be Philippi, and let's all plant churches in our hearts over the prisons in our lives. Amen.